to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, and to pay my respects. And also I just wanted to acknowledge I've been based in Singapore for 3 years, so it's interesting coming back to an Australian context and just interacting and drawing on the work of a number of Indigenous disability scholars in Australia. It's been really cool as well. So thanks very much, Katie, and thanks, Linda, for your work in setting this up and for the centre being hosted. It's lovely to back a curtain to see some old friends and meet people as well. So, and thanks for this, Katie. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you, because the idea that I would come and give a talk seemed entirely preposterous, given your body of work and those others in the room, such as Mike. So really the conversation, I think, is something I want to embrace. And maybe the feeling, so I think in terms of digital inclusion, the question, I think it's a really interesting one, because it's not necessarily some digital inclusion that I've felt like is a really terrific way of capturing things, right? But I think it's important, and I wonder if one of the things that's happened over the last few years, and we even wrote an article on this a couple of years ago with Maureen Hawkins, advocacy group, ACAD, is that there's sort of been a bit of a moment where digital inclusion speaks to people who are interested, right, in what's going on around social life, about everyday life, and the sense in which our lives really are becoming enabled, immersed, textured around digitality in digital different ways. So I think the term, I've always found the term is kind of useful in one sense and kind of has a certain sort of legibility, but I think it also cuts out other things, right, and obscures other aspects. And I think I do find it something a bit complicated, because the inclusion can have great prospects, right? There's a sense in which inclusion goes beyond access, which is how some people think about it. But in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, there's certain articles, like the one on education, forget the exact 24. So I'm not really a trained spotter in a way that our colleague and friend Rosemary Case, who helped author that section, who's now a custodian of the convention, you know, that conclusion there is really important, I think, around that. Then there's, I think, aspects of inclusion I think are really interesting about that it doesn't just sit there and you can kind of look at it and it speaks to you. I think inclusion, it really has a kind of complexity, right? At what scales do you think about inclusion, right? How does that work? I mean, how does inclusion work when you're running an event like this, right? Or having a conversation and trying to build in the relations around accessibility. How does it work, say, across an institution? Where does what's the sort of aspects of inclusion that you would build in around that? It seems to me there's a sort of architectures of inclusion. But I think, yes, I think maybe that's part of it, thinking, well, they're quite useful in a way. And I think one of the things that happened for me that I found really interesting around the pandemic, terrible pandemic, which is still underway. And I noticed that Samantha Connor gave a talk, right, from Curtin a couple of weeks ago, and last week was it? Unfortunately, I didn't get to hear it, just making the point that the pandemic has been absolutely terrible for many people. It continues so people with disabilities and disability communities, right? And that's really something that's unfolding. But in that process, I think one of the things around the pandemic was a sense of digitalisation that many of us have been working on, thinking about living for many years, really became something of essential, and also maybe a policy juggernaut that governments, particularly, notice this in sitting in Southeast Asia, being stuck on the island of Singapore for a couple of years during the pandemic, the governments were really talking about digitalisation as a key priority and pushing that, right? And I think that how that worked out was complicated, right? And I think maybe that's that other sense of inclusion, is that, so who's excluded, right? What's the exclusion? How can you acknowledge that and talk about that? And one of the things I'm struck by coming back to Australia is the robo-debt inquiry, right? So there's a number of royal commissions that have raised this: the Disability Royal Commission, the Royal Commission into Sexual Abuse, right? And now the robo-debt, I haven't got the names right, but the robo-debt commission that's starting to go away. So there's something that really affected a lot of people with disabilities, right? Because of that crossover between disability and income. And the way that that was rolled out, that's a kind of inclusion, but it's compulsory, right? So I think that seems to be the other thing that we're trying to understand at the moment around digital inclusion is that, maybe it's some of those, like, what does inclusion mean now? You know, what would it be? But what are those aspects of, say, the qualities of connectivity that are a bit more subtle around inclusion in a positive sense? And what are the costs of inclusion that are more about exclusion and that are more about kinds of digital inequalities, right? So what are the terms of inclusion? And there was this wonderful, when disability studies, particularly critical disability studies, was a bit still emerging in Australia. Someone called Mike Clear about 20 years ago did a book called, Promises, Disability in the Terms of Inclusion, which a lot of it was faced. We wrote essays, I think, about, particularly it was coming up New South Wales. But I've always thought that was really poignant. Like, what are those terms of inclusion? Andrew.
I think, in the pandemic, there was definitely a sense of I told you so, where
right.
we did that very quick digital pivot and,
right.
Really drew on a lot of ideas that people with disabilities had been shouting about and trying to get promises for a very long time. I wrote a book about people with disabilities working in the media in 2016.
Right.
It was like my return to work from maternity leave.
Right. Is this your disability in media work?
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of the media workers, that I was speaking to then were saying they wanted to work from home or they wanted, accessible digital work options, but they were working in an environment where they were told, no, this is too fast paced. People with disabilities can't. Actually, this is what they're being told. This is too fast paced.
Right.
You either have to go along with the embodied norm or you're not suited for this industry. And then, we had a situation where every single person had to work in that way that people with disabilities have been asking for a long time, even before 2016 when I got involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really striking, isn't it? And it's not so evident to me what the research was in, say, Australian context about pandemic disability. We've tried to pick that up in terms of looking at how is communication disability handled in the pandemic in Australia, right? But in the US context, there's some great work by Esther Hargitay, who's this leading scholar of digital inequalities and communications theory, you may know. She's just done a book on it, actually. Read it yet, don't get it as a hard copy. But she did with Kerry Dobransky, and I think it was Kerry Dobransky, who they'd done earlier papers on disability and digital divide that was really important. They did one about the pandemic. Maybe it was based in the US in 2021. I think what was really interesting in that for me was the sense in which in the cohort, a lot of people with disabilities were turning to particular social media to find information. Then also that sense of what you're saying is sort of like, oh, right. So there's, some of the things we fought for many years in terms of actually kind of trying to get that deeper inclusion around digital technology, that ability to work in different modes and to have that just regarded as what's normal, something became.
Yeah.
Those things have been sort of pre-worked on for many years.
I remember in the early stages of the pandemic, Mike, Eleanor and I got a bit excited about this change in a podcast or a couple of podcasts that we gave, but there seems to have been a reversal of that now.
Right.
So going back, return to normal. Why do you think that is, Gerard?
Good question. Well, I was struck by the Irish scholar of human rights, whose name will come back to me in a second, wrote this really good article about disability and COVID-19, where he kind of saying, look, a crisis of this sort lays bare a bit of a commonplace, right? A lot of things about, the power relations. And the one thing he was suggesting was that the take-up of the social model had been something we'd kind of assumed. By social model, I think it's being like the human rights model, the social approach, and so on. That perhaps we thought there'd been quite some progress made, let's say, right? But what happened in the pandemic was that revealed that the biomedical model, let's say, and other ways of sidelining disability, people with disabilities, had actually just really been shown that was always there, that it hadn't been entrenched. So part of his argument is to say that's part of what happened, is that maybe there's not that shift to the kind of bedrock power relations and social relations through the pandemic, that we're now in a situation where we're trying to perhaps look at some of those gains, innovations that were able to occur in this emergency situation and not able to actually entrench them. So, I mean, maybe that's kind of one sort of obvious thing to do. I mean, there's another really interesting bit of research I was having a look at, and I haven't looked at. I think, that's part of what we might be interested in as well, right? To others to say, look, what was this research around the pandemic? Because one of the interesting things in the pandemic around, I think, social sciences research was a lot of us having a bit of a go in areas where we mightn't, a lot of rapid response. I think Eleanor is saying, others probably engaged in sort of rapid response work, right? And then interest in that. In Australia, I know that the Learned Academies were providing that to the federal government on COVID-19 tracing apps for all the use it made in doing that research. So I think this is a really interesting body of work, but across so many disciplines. And I think it'd be really interesting to try and bring this together around disability. So we've looked at a bit of it, I'm sure others have, but to bring it together. But one piece I saw was really interesting. There was a rapid literature review by Chadwick and a team of people looking at people with intellectual disabilities during the pandemic and digital technology, and the sense in which, yes, there'd been a kind of take up. There'd been greater recourse to that. There'd been a lot of support, but not necessarily from people who work in sort of digital inclusion literacy, but in some ways it was more other support agencies, workers and so on who provided support for the take up and the kind of adoption of digital technology. But otherwise, their sense from the research that they looked at was that, things haven't really changed, that for people with intellectual disabilities, there wasn't actually the sense of coming out of the pandemic that was going to change, that there was really a set of measures and otherwise supports to change that kind of relationship, to actually give that capabilities, to give that kind of all those dimensions of, say, digital capabilities of inclusion, citizenship in a positive sense.
So when I think about digital inclusion, in preparing my notes for this talk, I was thinking we think about access to digital life. So access is, yes, a big part of it. We also need to think about how people with disabilities are supported to acquire digital technologies or to be able to engage in those kinds of deals and those platforms, because there is an economic and a monetary side of that. Attitudes come into it, when we've got the NDIS, which doesn't provide support for people to have iPads as an assistive technology because they're, a mainstream and fun device. And in Meryl Alpha's work, she's talked about children at schools having their iPads taken off them if they, don't follow the rules. So I think there's an important attitude side to it. But I also think we need to think about what you were just talking about now, which is literacy and teaching people how to use these devices, these worlds, engage, within them. So there's a lot of talk, all government communication services will be digital by whatever year they've decided on, but there's not so much talk about teaching these groups. And I know this is a big issue for people with intellectual disabilities, how to use digital devices. This came up in our Vision Australia project recently too, where we spoke to people in Vision Australia about how would you like to communicate with Vision Australia, and overwhelmingly, we're talking to people 65 plus, and they say, I want to be taught how to use a Sonic code. Right. I want to learn how to set up a smart home. Yeah. Things like that. So people might be interested in engaging in those digital worlds, but they don't know how. Whether it's an economic factor or a literacy factor, I think we need to think about these kinds of issues too. So I'm going to ask you a question that were going to ask me because I'm interested in what your views on this. So Jared was going to ask me, is it better to talk about disability and digital citizenship or justice? Do you think, Jared? Citizenship or justice?
Question.
This is a tricky one.
Roundly critiqued. It's an inclusion. I think they can be both useful, actually. It's interesting what you're talking about then around talking about sort of digital literacy and ability, capability. Actually, maybe one of the best ways that this is measured in Australia is the Australian Disability and Digital Inclusion Index, which come out of Swinburne, and then now we start out of the Centre of Excellence on the Automated Decision-Making Society. You can have a look at that disability measure. That it shows that kind of on aggregate, people with disability have like a 62.1 sort of score on the index versus 72. That score is a composite thing, and it combines the access, affordability, ability, I think they call it. But I think that digitally, to pick this up, cues us into thinking about these broader aspects, right? That the sense in which to understand what's occurring around digital society or our use of digital technologies needs a much broader account. I think citizenship is actually quite a useful one. And I was kind of interested a few years ago, there's a great collection on digital citizenship that colleagues, Tim Koska did, colleagues in our field that had a lot of different contributions. And I did a piece on disability and digital citizenship. And in part, it was just a sense of how digital citizenship is being taught in, say, schools, right? It did seem to be one-dimensional. It's probably become broader. And that to think around those two things was incredibly important. And the idea that maybe the commonplace thing that to belong, to be a member, to be genuinely part of, participate into society and social life really required that sense that what we call citizenship really now incorporate, the digital dimension. But I suppose once you start talking about citizenship, one of the obvious things is the exclusions there are huge, right? And I think that really came out for me in the pandemic. I mean, Singapore, the celebrated case, of course, in international scene was Singapore's record and dealing with public health was sort of really put in a bad light because the treatment of migrant workers in dormitories, became one of the obvious things. You've got people who are less than citizens, various ways, whether that's informal ways. We saw that in contentious ways in Australia and many other countries as well. And those digital technologies played out in different ways as well. So I think one of the issues probably is around citizenship is, how do you think across that, right? And there's the work people are doing, I think, in digital migrant studies. People at Converse at Utrecht University and Urban Caballero, who does work on Filipino diaspora, based in Deca, who are looking at that sense in which, of course, we talked about the 20th century as the century of migration, right? But migration flows and who counts in the society, mobilities are really crucial. That really was thrown up in the pandemic in those ways where borders shut down, in ways we stopped thinking about, some societies at least. And then how digital technology supported that. So I think that adds complexity of how if you're interested in tackling these aspects of how it's crucial for people to have that, capacity, the affordability and so on of digital technology. How do they do that if you're migrants in society, if you're not getting access to citizenship in other ways? So I think citizenship is really interesting. I think it does seem to at least flesh out some aspects of talking about inclusion, and that's going to be really important to say that, it matters that you get digital technologies for fun or for pleasure or for a bunch of other things. It's not just serious games or serious aspects of life. There's these other aspects of things. I think justice is a really interesting one, right? The emergence of disability justice. I don't know in the Australian context how we might see that, how that plays. It comes, I gather, in part from the US context, is that right? Disability justice. And I've done a little bit of work actually with Tony Dreyer, is a scholar at New South who works on listening. We've done, we just did a workshop about media justice. So, I mean, I'm kind of interested in what that brings in, and I think in digital, it clearly brings in a lot of things, which you're thinking about the compulsory digitality, right? The sense in which for digital government services, you know, you have to access that. You have to have a copper tracing app. You might have an app, which is what happened to migrant workers in the Singapore context in the pandemic. Apps that tracked you in and out of the dormitory. Apps that where you had to show to say if you were fit for work. You know, that you've got a whole bunch of aspects there about justice in that sense, perhaps in the more oppressive aspects. And then I suppose there's the broader aspects of how you think about perhaps social justice. Maybe that's another way of thinking about it. Maybe in an Australian context, in another context, it's all about social justice, right? And what does social justice in media mean? But I suppose justice has its particular.
Yeah, I took this question really seriously, and I don't have the answer. That's why I took it so seriously. Yeah. And this is a lot of people here from my critical disability reading group.
Great.
Over this side. And we've talked about justice a little bit in the group. So look, I agree with you. I think we need to talk about those citizenship and justice.
Right.
And trying to think about what the difference might be between talking about citizenship and justice, I started thinking about people with disabilities as experiential experts.
Right.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, like people with disabilities having the knowledge, having,
you
know, knowing what we should do to facilitate better inclusion. To include participating this way. So I like justice in the sense that it does foreground people with disabilities as the experts and recognise, you know, that there are other intersectional issues happening too. It's not just disability. Disability is a different thing. You know, race, gender, class, and etc. all come into it. So I like justice for that reason. I've also been thinking about it because in one of my ARC reviews, one of my reviewers actually used our work.
Right.
That article you referred to earlier that we wrote with Wayne Hawkins.
Right.
Said, you know, drawing on Goggin, whatever year it was, why aren't you talking about justice? Why are you focusing on access?
Seems like a good idea at the time.
I co-wrote the paper.
I love that review.
When it comes
I've done it myself.
Yes, it has happened before. Yeah. So in responding to that, I actually still think, you know, it's really important that we do talk about access. We don't stop talking about access. And a lot of times in my work, I like to think about the solutions being collaborative. Right. So, you know, a conversation or a co-design between people with disabilities, the community, governments. I still think governments really have an important role in there. And I'm not sure where disability justice comes down on that. Yeah. And also bringing in industry to see what kind of solutions they might come. It's part of the conversation. So I'm really, really intrigued about disability justice, and I don't think I know enough about it. It does seem to be a US thing that we probably haven't engaged in quite so much here in Australian critical disability studies. But I'm really interested in it. And if any of you want to make a comment.
Well, I mean, the other interesting thing to take on from the US context is design justice, right? So the work of Sasha Constanzo Shock. So in Sasha's work, I mean, they put a real emphasis on design justice being about marginalised communities and intervening around design, which I think is really interesting when you talk about collaboration and co-design, right? Because that's such an important area. So that might be another thing. But I can't tend to agree. It's interesting for people to think that there's a different perspective on justice. I mean, one of the things, I was trying to think of the philosopher, Nussbaum, right, does a lot of work. She's done a lot of work on disability, species, and so on, nationalism. Also, justice is really important there, but in the Rawlsian sense, is that right? I'm trying to remember. So I think there's that. It'd be interesting to think about justice in other ways and what that resonance is in other contexts.
Did you want to ask a question, Amy?
Well, just to comment that, like, sorry, I came in late today, I've already talked about, but so the ones running behind me, sorry.
I said apologies if you've already talked about this as I came in slightly late, but I was just sort of more of a comment thinking about citizenship and refusal, like justice allows for refusal in a way maybe that citizenship doesn't, because you talked about migration issues with citizenship, but there's also sovereignty issues and, you know, people and groups of people that don't really want to be citizens in the way that we kind of, and which also makes me think about the digital refusal and talk about access, but like, is there also a strand of holding on to the right to not participate and to not have, like, if you have to, I always think of going to Centrelink when I was on, you know, parenting payments and seeing all these old people up the back of the room just so frustrated with with being forced to learn how to do what they needed to do to get their welfare payments. And I like just thinking how much easier their lives would have been if they could have had the right to say, no, I'm not going to do it this way, just fill in the form for me. You know?
I think this is a really big issue for disability right now. This is one of the things I think we need to talk about. Forced inclusion. Disabilities are going to have to start dealing with everything online, and they're not ready, and they don't know how. In some cases, people don't want to. There are people that do want to do it, can't because they don't know how, or they're not supported to do that. And we need to think that through. Generally, in disability support, we talk a lot about alternative formats and making sure people with disabilities have access to, you know, the same information in different ways or in the ways that they choose to receive that. I don't see that happening at Centrelink. I can't see that happening at Centrelink. Interested to hear what Gerard thinks about it.
I guess, sorry, my point was also that there's some interesting work on refusal coming out of Indigenous sovereignty kind of area that might have interesting coalitional implications for digital disability.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. No, that's, I think, a really powerful, important sort of suggestion, right? Following it, say, the thing about sovereignty gives a, gives a different perspective on citizenship, like you're saying, in terms of Indigenous perspectives on that as well. I think more about that.
I need some time for this one.
But I think it's incredibly important because if you think even in, I mean, say digital media studies, right? There's a lot of work about what's the varieties of things like, you know, whether it's Kate Crawford's, you know, what is it? Listening, not lurking paper, right? The famous paper about listening. When I teach, because I teach a lot of global media governance and policy, digital platforms, so I teach this piece of just kind of it's really great about, you know, people sort of passively using and a resistance there. And it seems to me like in a sort of garden variety sense, you know, there's real gradations between use and non-use, right? So that's pretty straightforward, but we forget about non-use. But I think that like the denial, the active resistance are really critical. And increasingly people are saying, as in the work of you know, Nick Caldry and Mahias, right? The data colonial work, saying just everyone's saying, look, really, to use this device, other devices, you know what, I have to give you my data so you can sell it back to me. Is that great? You know, and maybe part of the response is to say, has been data sovereignty, right, in different flavours. I don't think that captures, to the extent I understand it, Indigenous sovereignty or other kinds of sovereignty as well. But it is in a sense saying, look, we're just really unhappy about this. You know, we used to talk about the commons. I've got an interest, I've got a new project I'm trying to work up on after the smartphone. Because it seems to be part of the problem is that it's not like we get these different forums to talk about the technology. And I think, you know, in one sense, you know, if you're really into the International Telecommunications Union and following 5G and 6G technical debates, yeah, okay, we can try and have a conversation. But the idea that you would have a different system where you might say, look, I'm really happy because there's some commons, or I've got some ability to have this data collective, right? So I think people have been trying to have experiments about data collective. And the older ideas we might have had about whether you can be, you know, particular sovereign group or different community, and you could be a community broadcaster or something like this. Older models that we have in Australia around Indigenous broadcasting, community broadcasting, you know, it's a different scene now, and it's really complex in relation to this. So I think there's questions around disability. I think that is really interesting to talk about. I think the digital government services, I remember doing this away day with PWD in Redfern actually, where we started to talk about Centrelink doing exactly these things. And so it was a day in which people came in, some people in that organisation were doing, you know, direct work and advocacy in different parts of the country. So someone from far north Queensland saying the obvious as well. Why do people have to do that? Why? And I think the other part I just wanted to add in is that this is a broader theme around technology since I started working. So I started working in this area through working for a national community organisation, lobbying around then consumers telecommunications, now ACAD. And one of the recurrent things where you go along to these policy encounters or industry encounters, and the basic thing is to say, look, we've got to use technology, you know, you've got to learn to love it. And then the problem is, why don't people love the technology? Right? So this whole literature is not to, I've got more respect for them and less knee-jerk about them, about acceptance of technology. So if you want to do research from the humanities and social sciences perspective, a lot of the way you do it is about, you can get money to see why people acceptance of technology, robotics or, you know, driverless cars. So colleagues in Singapore were doing work on, they got work to do work actually on attitudes of people with disabilities and older people towards driverless cars. And it was very good work actually, but it's about acceptance of technology. So I think if you're questioning that frame, like, and why wouldn't you, right? Because it just seems that's the black boxing of technology, because it's the social relations that are becoming congealed in that technology, which is the sort of Bruno tool way to see things. But generally, it's like the technology comes with these social relations and power relations. And that's part of why it's to the fore. And I think around disability, technology has been to the fore, but we don't read disability technology. But you know, generally, it's not read. It's about the disability hasn't been about political sense. You can see that in. But it is in Australia because over the last few years it's become evident it's political justice ways of moving about it. And technology and disability seem more about digital inclusion and narratives. It's more about design. It's not about a contest about social life. I think it is about a contest of social life. It's also about incredible, you know, utopian possibilities, but not if you just have a technicised.
It strikes me that how we think about disability really feeds into this too. You know, I'm doing a project looking at all the minutes of a government meeting, which is called the Data and Digital Ministers Meeting with Jess Perryman, who was a visiting fellow here recently. And we're really struck by the way that disability keeps being brought into discussions about data and technology. You know, it's sort of like a narrative within this discussion. So they might not be talking about disability at all, but disability comes in and it's used as the example, you know, the digital transformation strategy, or for why we should be communicating digitally for, you know, Medicare, Centrelink, etc. Just the disability is it's constantly there, but it's not.
Yeah.
You know, I don't see it as being about the lived experience of disability. It's about kind of what disability represents, or even a fear of disability.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff about having a national database of birth defects seemed to be a big priority across a number of minutes of these meetings.
Right.
You know, and then we had the pandemic and it shifted a little.
Right.
It's come back to this database again.
Yeah.
You know, so the medical approach to disability seems really at the front there here in Australia. So I've been a terrible timekeeper, which I'm sure no one's surprised about. So we were hoping to open it up at this point for questions from you guys as well. If anyone wanted to ask Gerard anything. Or me, you won't know how I would respond. My goodness.
Very glad. had some stuff about justice and citizenship, but we sort of dwelt on that quite a bit. I'm interested going back to the start of your discussion when you were talking about the pandemic and how suddenly everyone worked the way that people with disability had said, I could actually do this job, but I just need to work from home and we could use my computer. And then everyone was, and suddenly it was all possible. And then how that sort of is exposed as some sort of ableism by the fact that everyone's been forced back into the office. And there's sort of this argument that if the CBDs aren't full, then our coffee shops will fail. And this sort of, I don't know, urban economic ableism or something. I don't have a good name for it, but this idea that actually there wasn't a massive drop in productivity. Everyone still was able to work at home, but now those sort of prejudices just came flying back unchallenged, and people with disabilities, you know, are finding themselves, oh, okay, well, if I didn't get a job in that time, I still don't have one and I can't get it under those circumstances. So it just seems to me that out of the pandemic, for me, one of the lasting things is this: everyone get back to the office, go back to the way you were, and the sort of the forces driving that. And I'm just interested in your comments on that.
I mean, as you said that, Mark, I was just really struck by that because it seemed very little contesting of that economic ableism or disableism that you're talking about, right? That people pointing out the different economic account. And so maybe, I mean, I feel like I'm still maybe having shifted back a bit, just trying to understand, like in my own workplace, how things work now and what's happened and what is the message the institution organisation saying around how we, you know, retain those modes of participation. Well, I mean, I wonder if maybe part of it is starting back around understanding work and how are digital technologies textured in people's lives in the pandemic? Because I'm just thinking about the other things about work, about the sense in which, you know, for some of us occupationally, it is possible to do your work, you know, via these technologies if they're configured. And we know that the accessibility of Zoom, right, is a work in progress. Even at universities, it takes how you get the audio right, for instance, is a complex thing. We try to do that at the beginning, right? But we know that that's really hard, and there's different approaches around that. But I'm just thinking for all those people who clearly, you know, are the digital figures in different ways. I mean, one group of workers whose perhaps digital practice were also under the spotlight a bit was the gig economy workers, right? And I think one of the interesting things in Southeast Asia was the ways in which, what you were talking about, Katie, the imaginaries, right? The ways that disability crops up was around the gig economy workers. So clearly there was a sort of narrative about that food delivery services, other sort of services are really crucial to us being at home and locked down. So who's doing the work? And then a lot of people with disabilities were doing that work, right? So in the Singapore context, let's say, there was a sense in which that became a narrative, actually. And there's a colleague, Rennie Hong at National University of Singapore, who did some research with people working for the equivalent of Uber here, Grab in Southeast Asia, and talked to them about, you know, what was the nature of that work? To what extent did that give them more economic opportunities in the pandemic? What were those kind of practices? And then the mixes of precarity and then debility, that concept from Jasmine Bois about this work on debility and debilitation, the sense in which, you know, work, as we know, is often good for incubating different kinds of impairment, right? And debilitation. And so I think, you know, maybe part of it is just trying to see what's this field, the different kind of fields in which it was playing out in the pandemic. How did this work? And then at this stage now, just trying to think through, you know, what that process, because clearly, as you say, it does seem entirely preposterous to say that for economic reasons people need to go back, particularly when people do seem to be resisting going back, right? Because that has made for a lot of us our lives easier. And for some of us in my case, in privileged academic jobs for a while, feeling like you could actually configure a life that would enable you to be doing caring your work and responsibilities and so on, and to shift your work around, and to see that generalised across parts of the workplaces you're in, you know, in a way that's, you know, kind of often, you know, in some ways working for people, and to see that closed down immediately or from a broader economic injunction seems entirely problematic. But I wonder if that is part of a, I don't entirely understand where's that at in terms of more broadly, workers having those rights to have that incorporated. That seems an industrial battle at the moment. And then around disability and work, particularly that recognition, that it seems like there perhaps was this little recognition that, oh, right, well, this is something that a lot of people with disabilities have been fighting for ages and not been granted. Now it's here, isn't that great? And everyone's doing it. And then no sense in which, how can we keep this going?
I think we also need to think about how this might create exclusions for people with disabilities. And I've spoken about this, I think, at one of our high school meetings before, where if, you know, we set up this scenario where the people with disabilities come into work or students with disabilities come in digitally and, you know, no other way, what then happens to the built environment and accessibility there, or accessibility of public transport and getting to places? You know, I would hate to see those kinds of gains, you know, be reduced as well if, you know, we're setting up a situation where people with disabilities do only come in via Zoom or WebEx, you know, hell. So I think I really do celebrate all of the digital access, you know, ways of working and different ways of being that have come out of this pandemic, you know, and I hope that sticks around and we don't, you know, sort of try to snap back quickly to this, what is effectively a social construction of normal ways of doing things. But at the same time, I think we need to think about maintaining a level of accessibility in our outdoor spaces to ensure people with disabilities can have the choice that people without disabilities have about whether they work from home or whether they, you know, come in to campus. I think Sadia had a question.
That's great.
My question is an extension of what Amy had said a while ago, that as you mentioned about old people for whom this digital inclusion is more of a pressure and it's not easy. So like actually, I'm from Pakistan, which is in South Asia. So when we talk about digital inclusion, it's not same across the globe. For example, when we talk about countries like Pakistan or India and many other parts of the world where everyone does not have equal access to the internet. One, everyone does not have the access to the internet. And second, the systems do not make it any easier for people with disabilities. Like in Australia, of course, they're like no system is perfect. We do criticize NDIS. But then if we talk about countries where such systems do not exist at all. So don't you think that sometimes insisting upon digital inclusion, because it happened with many students in Pakistan when they had this online thing, many students were unable to give their exams because the internet was not fast enough. So how do we navigate systems in a way that digital inclusion is not only for people with disabilities living in the first world, but globally?
Thank you, Sally. That's a really incredibly important intervention. Well, it is an absolute imperative. Here, too much seeing it through the lenses of two advanced societies, Australia and Singapore, so that it's pretty obvious. So I think the view is much darker, at the Pakistan perspective of the world. And I think that is something where I feel like the disability and digital inclusion conjunction has only been really starting to emerge a bit more. I think around digital inclusion that one of the things globally has been, say, the emergence of mobiles. Mobiles is a way to provide, a lot of societies essentially mobile first. So I think for a lot of people who are in, context, resource deprived context or constrained context, as the jargon goes, when people are poor, people in different settings are using mobile phones. But I think that has a real complexity to what happens, right? So that the invention of prepaid mobiles made a certain sort of affordability available, but it's like, in England where you would put coins in your electricity meter, and you might be doing it this winter as well, and you'd be self-disconnecting, right? So you've got this complexity to how people access mobiles, the extent to which they access mobile internet. And someone called Jonathan Donner wrote a really fantastic book on that a few years ago called Internet, where it was really looking at these contexts and had a model about that. It'd be really interesting to see that updated in a systematic way now. So I think, for me, part of it is about, is a sort of ongoing sense in which, as you're presenting it, it just seems much clearer, actually, why, and I didn't present it with any of that clarity and talk about digital inclusion in the first instance. It's really critical, right, in different ways, it seems to me. And then around disability and digital inclusion, that's really difficult. I was fortunate enough to do a piece of work with a Sri Lankan-based NGO that's really amazing called Learn Asia, L-I-R-N-E. They style themselves as pro-poor and pro-market. And they're run by a couple of really interesting people there. Their CEO and Halani, I just forget her last name, and Brian Samajiva, who was their kind of chair of the board, but was a regulator in Sri Lanka. And one of the things they started to do in recent years was a number of pieces of research in, I don't think in Pakistan, but in Sri Lanka and India around disability. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of it was about assistive technology. And I think one of the policy constructs in the area, I think, is around assistive technology. So WHO has a big strategy. There's a lot of energy around it, around assistive technology. So I think one of the interesting things, and I've been recently working with colleagues in the South African context. South Africa is interesting because the one who's got quite advanced, it's kind of like sort of first world technology, and then it's got lots of areas that don't have it. In the apartheid era, that was really striking. We were doing work there in the mid-90s, and in different places like Soweto, there might have been one payphone per many hundreds of thousands, whereas in cities with really incredible infrastructure. Mobiles seem to have bridged the gap, but I think that's the case. So I think one of the things in that context is that people are also looking at assistive technology. And I think one of the reasons they do, and through a WHO framework, is in some ways the severity of the need, right? The starkness of the need. But I think that is only part of the puzzle. That in Australia, and I think in the work we do, Katie, I mean, one of the things I felt that there's people who work in assistive technology that might be funded through the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That might be about working with someone to find the technology they need, but that's incredibly important. The other part of it is how do you get accessibility built into systems? How do you get accessibility built into devices? How does that come together? So I think one of the things I wonder about now is if you think about global disability and digital inclusion, it's about bringing together those two aspects and then thinking through the work. I think is only beginning in a way about how you would get disability and digital inclusion working on those different levels.
This reminds me of a paper Mike and I wrote a long time ago, where we were trying to make an argument about technology being born accessible. Technology going through different phases, but as we have worked, I think we've become more and more immersed in technology being part of our lives. So when we first started working together, we were talking about the iPhone, and how it was inaccessible for people with disabilities.
And the first papers.
It was our first, it was our very first paper. And
MC.
In MC, and then just only a couple of weeks later, Apple made the iPhone accessible. So this is why Mike and I are academics today, because we claim you know, responsibility for that, but not really. But yeah,
That's impact.
that's it.
Research
This is an
impact.
impact statement. And at the same time, to riff on what Gerard was just saying about assistive technology, JAWS came out with a patch to use with the iPhone that was really, really expensive. I mean, JAWS is already very expensive, and then they had another, cost added on to this assistive technology to, facilitate people with vision impairment and blindness using the iPhones. So what Mike and I were arguing in this paper, to get to my point, is that eventually technology will be born accessible, because we've already had, all these arguments and agitation before with other platforms. And that, like what Gerard said about the mobile phone, perhaps that is the way to make technology accessible in these spaces that you're talking about. Yeah. Kelly's got a question or a comment.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a question. Or it's just pondering as I'm hearing all of the bits and the whole idea of disability justice, and I'm thinking that it's kind of all disability justice, because I'm piecing together all of this and sort of thinking, like, who is included, who's not included, and all of these sort of things sort of talk to me in my mind. I'm sort of thinking, it's about privilege and deepening divides, and the more privileged you are, the more accessible these things are. The more the more you're able to have a job that allows you to work from home, or choose to work from home if that's what you want to do, or choose not to go back into the office and argue the case not to go back to the office, and those sorts of things. The more accessible the technologies are, the more you can afford the technologies, those sorts of things, the more you live in a country where you can, and then the idea of the refusal to participate. If you're more privileged, then you have more ability to refuse to participate and refuse, to have those, and have the ability to have those choices. And I wonder if that's where the disability justice stuff comes in. And if that's what disability justice is, you have digital citizenship. The more digital citizenship that comes in, that's fine. But is it only for the privileged? And is it just deepening that divide? And is that disability justice? I don't know. Like, is that a question? Is that just me pondering all of these things?
It doesn't. It's a great intervention, and it doesn't sound like justice, does it?
It doesn't to me. It sounds like it's just pushing the privileged further privileged, and the less able and the less privileged further down the line. And I think for a lot of people, it doesn't sound like justice. To me, it just doesn't sound fair. And that's what, to me, justice is.
So one of the ways that's handled with the critique of justice is, Nick Clovis says, he says, in some ways, and I think it's Amartya said, to say, instead of talking about justice, you're looking at injustices, right? That sounds like an injustice.
Exactly.
And that's great, Kelly. I think you put it really, and I think that's it. That is the crossroads. I think for a lot of people, that is the crossroads, right? And I think it's a disability crossroads as well. And I think, but more generally, we have the opportunity, a few years ago, there was something called there's a consortium on social progress internationally. So we did a 3-volume report on different aspects, and media and communications was part of that. Actually, Nick Coldry led an international team, also I can be one of the 17 of them. And we wrote in, actually, disability as a cross-cutting case around this. But part of the proposition was got this, to say, well, this is where things have come. After the McBride report, and the McBride report was this big, really important report 4 years ago, done by Sean McBride, which was basically saying, you've kind of got the sort of, the rich part of the world and then the rest. And it caused, amongst other things, the US at this stage, exited UNESCO, because it was the anti-colonial moment. People saying, well, the world's media infrastructures are not owned; they're not in the hands of people around the world. So, coming from McBride, what we wrote a few years ago was, in a sense, a version of this to say, this is the situation. We are at a crossroad. We continue at a crossroads. And I think there's lots of ways in which this has, come up, right? Whether it's around the inability of people to moderate content, whether it's about hate speech, whether it's about misogyny, violence online, a bunch of other things. But I think around disability, there might be a sense in which maybe it's hard to put the urgency of this, but I think in terms of the privilege and what you were saying, about, it seems to me there are some of them are infrastructures, right? And then, you know, a lot of people in the world don't have smartphones, they have feature phones. So there's a real continuum with phones. But behind the smartphone, and I think this comes out in Kate Crawford's book, her great book on the Atlas of AI, the smartphones are like a little node of a massive infrastructure, because if you try to run your translation, Google Translate on your phone, off in rural WA, you probably find it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because you need cloud computing, you need infrastructure. So in part, I think it's about, that's part of the privilege as well. So if you're dealing with a lot of parts of the countries where in some ways the colonial roots still dictate where the cables get laid, you know, what the concentrations are. It's hard to shift, and maybe what part of the work people have been doing is to say that we haven't understood how disability wraps around that, right, or how that works. And it's not just about digital inclusion in that narrow sense, it's about these fuller senses, right, and capture the full dimensions.
Wonderful, wonderful insight, and also has me thinking about, you know, making the decision to opt out and how that I see this as actually being leveraged. You know, for example, Centrelink does make it so difficult for people to, you know, apply for the aged care pension, and that actually stops people from doing that. So, you know, the government's not paying that pension to these people until they get to the point where they really, really have no other choice and have to try and get in and do it. Did you all watch the Q&A the other night? It was on the NDIS Q&A. The topic was probably a couple of weeks ago. They had NDIS, and this actually came up in the discussion. You know, the Liberal minister that was there, Stuart Rogers, I think he was saying everyone's on the NDIS. You know, the NDIS is for everyone. Everyone's on it, and someone in the audience, you know, who I think we might describe as somewhat privileged, you know, and having the financial means and a family member willing to be their carer and drive them to their job and so on and things like that. So actually, I really need the NDIS, and I can't figure out how to apply for it, you know. And she was actually a teacher. She was a music teacher or something, so had an education, should know how to, you know, navigate these sorts of forms, but she couldn't do it. So she made the decision, yeah, I'm just not going to bother with this support. And there were other people, you know, in the room and on the panel who were saying the NDIS has been absolutely life-changing for me. You know, I have a job now, I can get a wheelchair that's not from Good Sammy's, for example. So, you know, there was a real sense of the importance of the NDIS. But one person said, I couldn't get on, so I'm just not bothering with it. And the minister said, there's people there to help you. They'll help you apply. But, you know, we know that's not what is always happening in practice. So I think, you know, we also need to think about the way this privilege is weaponised and used as an exclusion as well.
Well, and like you're saying, you know, with the iPads, and, you know, it's being policed and gatekept about what it's being used for and how it isn't. And it's like the NDIS is all about choice, right? So if the choice is that the iPad is there for not just a communication tool, but also to participate in normal forms of, you know, childhood, you know, participatory things, you know, going on YouTube or, you know, playing a game or whatever, then what's wrong with that? You know, isn't that what my peers are doing? So why can't I choose to do that as part of my NDIS thing? Like, that's a choice thing, right? You know, and like I used to have the same arguments with adults who wanted to smoke who had disabilities. You know, why can't they smoke? Other adults who don't have disabilities choose to smoke. That's a choice thing, right? So, you know, just because it's not good for your health doesn't mean that you get to police that, you know. And so it's about like a privilege thing again. It's like, you know, if you're in a privileged position of power, what right do you have to make those choices for somebody? The NDIS was supposed to change that and supposed to provide that position of power back to the participant. has it done that? Has it made those achievements? I think, you know, we need to start questioning those things. Are we questioning those things, or are we just looking in the wrong places?
Seems to me this comes back to attitudes again and stigma and how we think about disability and how people with disabilities are positioned to be grateful for any help they can get. It is not considered a right, it's considered a charity. I was actually involved in an ethical debate maybe about 10 years ago at one of the state WA disability conferences about whether carers should be helping people with disabilities smoke. I was in that ethical discussion, and it was, you know, many issues. And it also reminds me of that workshop we went to where carers of people with intellectual disabilities were talking about how they should support people with intellectual disabilities to participate online. And it was so gendered. I'm sure I've talked to most of you about this before. You know, they were worried about sexting for the girls sexting, and they were worried about, you know, the men using too much porn, right? And we're talking about adults here, and rather than, you know, talking about how they could help people with disabilities engage in these online platforms for benefit or for fun or whatever, it was about all the risks, and it was about all the gendered risks.
That was about risks for carers as well. So the concern,
Which often overshadows.
yeah, I mean, that was a big, you know, the peak body of carer organisations in WA, and there was that. It was gendered, but it was always through well, if we've got a computer in the middle of the lounge room and one of the residents is choosing to look at hardcore porn all the time, how do we deal with our carers? You know, which is not, you know, in a way it's kind of holistic. You know, we've got staff as well that we need to include in these equations, but it was that privilege of, if this thing is something we see as a vice, then it's sort of an add-on, even though it's just part of, I suppose, it is a part of citizenship or justice. So, you know.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I think that's where I was sort of coming at from is that, well, citizenship is about like the right to be included and have it, you know, to be a member, you know, participation. But then justice is about, well, how fair is it, and how, you know.
I think it's endemic of a range of, you know, digital accessibility through government. You know, at the start when we had the WA Health app or whatever, which is the only way you could get in anywhere, and I couldn't sign up to it, and I'm posting on Facebook, I'm actually a professor of internet studies. Connected this device because it won't recognise a photo of my passport.
Yeah.
And, you know, thankfully my super privilege means all my Facebook friends like, I know you need to do this and this and this and this. Yeah. But, you know, there is that, there's, you know, a lot of accessibility around digitalisation and citizenship, and, you know, I think that's disability, but it's also broader discussions that we see, and global justice as well, as, you know, so disability sits on it as part of the whole area of inclusion and, you know, access and exclusion. Sorry, hijacking topic.
Do you have a question, Eleanor?
Well, I just thought that historically,
Oh, we've got some questions online.
Oh, cool. I was wondering if assuming participants were.
That was just me saying you've got questions.
Oh, it's just
Good,
mine.
thank you.
so I was just thinking that, I mean, historically, coming from being a software developer, interface designer for various different organizations, that we went through a long period of time where you did think about accessibility a lot, but all the systems that you were working with were actually remarkably simple, really, and there wasn't much you could do to change the way the interface worked other than to make it as clear as possible. And, you know, you had no mouse, you know, there was no idea of windows and tabs and all these things that could go wrong. And then when these systems started getting more complicated, we still retained that for a long period of time, particularly in if you're working in a government-related organisation or a university, for example, you kept in mind always the fact that people would have limited access to newer tech. So, you know, it would all be designed for a tiny screen. It would all be designed for the most basic model of computer. You weren't allowed to look at the bells and whistles that were possible through this technology because you had to make sure that broadly everyone, but then back in that day, were we thinking about people with disabilities? Not really, no. We were thinking about just people in general in homes. And now technology has become so complicated and we've all got these different devices and ways of accessing things. We just completely stopped thinking about it. You know, is it accessible in all browsers? No one thinks about that anymore. Is it and then if you take it further, is it accessible to screen readers? Are the colours sensibly designed for someone who's going to have issues actually seeing what's on the screen? This stuff then comes, that's like the second layer now of accessibility. And I think we really lost something when that happened. So the explosion of technology has been great in terms, because I often think of almost all technology says having the potential to be assistive, or at least assistive to someone, right?
That's right.
But accessible, oh, that's hard, you know.
Yeah.
And from a development perspective, that genuinely is hard, right? It's not always that people are just being bloody minded and not developing it because it's costly or whatever. It actually can be just hard. But it is something that should be like prioritized, I think. And that's like a justice and it's all wrapped into one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, maybe the positive, Eleanor, I mean, is there a positive in that? I mean, some attention is maybe it's the interfaces and some of the intermediary points. But if you can make a operating system, right, with mobile phones or other aspects, you can build accessibility into that. So your ecosystem is more supportive of people who then want to add things. It'd be interesting to know, and you've just done the games. This is the point where I get to plug it for you. But I was just wondering about that because we've just started more via my colleague Marcus Carter, who's worked a lot on the games from Sydney. He worked on VR and AR. So we've been given funding by Meta to work on disability and the metaverse. So I mean, one of the things is essentially VR and AR. But one of the interesting things is talking to them about early on. I think it's fair to say that that they are quite interested in these things, right? Actually, that even tech companies, hopefully, they're retaining their jobs as we speak. But they are quite interested in things that they could potentially take on board, and it's great to see that openness. But maybe part of that complexity is some of the path dependency, right? How you actually ensure that if in people working in the crunch, right? They're just under the pump to try and get this stuff designed, and in contexts where, as we know, the work in different corporations, or if you're just a freelancer, right? The precarity, how do you do that? And I think that's real. I don't know a lot about that actually. I think just hearing people talk about that a bit more, about how do you think about these issues from those perspectives, right? And that's about the collaborations with a bunch of different people. So in this project, it's fairly straightforward. We'll talk to users in Australia and Singapore because we've got two sets of academics, but also disability advocacy organisations and communities involved in both ends. Talk to users and talk to designers and try and think about the policy. But to some extent, there certainly probably organisations like that are less interested in grand legal policy, more interested in part of what you're saying, like how does that work? How could you actually do accessibility and inclusive design in these contexts and design justice?
Yeah, but I also suspect that given the idea of wanting to give people the choice to reject technology or I know plenty of people, I put mostly in my case older age people who reject technology. And would not access anything through any new technology because they just didn't trust it. And the only way around that was to have people to do that work for them, so to extend the idea of the help desk towards actually being like more of a physical help desk, if you like, not just someone like talking you through it on the phone or whatever, but someone actually prepared to do things for you. And the only time I've ever experienced that has been in an incredibly privileged position myself, where someone's just done all the forms for me. But that's because of who I was and the organization I was dealing with, and the fact that, you know, I had a personal customer woman, that actually it was, on the phone, who was prepared to go, oh, you hate doing all these financial forms, I'll just do them for you. And I was like, yay. And then I'm just thinking, yeah, but I'm probably not really the target for that sort of support, am I? But that's what. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, so I have paid it forward, but you know, and that's really probably what people need in a sense, in anything where you actually need to be able to be on that system. Well, you should be offered that support, shouldn't you? So you don't have to deal with the technology yourself.
Maria has her hand up. Sure, I can get Maria to speak.
Well, do you can speak for her, or?
If you heard that, Maria, you can just unmute yourself and you should come magically through to the room with us.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mike. Well, my question is actually about irrelevance and privilege. And I'm very interested in, Katie and Gerard, in your thoughts about digital technologies, privilege and irrelevance. And I think it's important for me to provide a little bit of context. So earlier in the discussion, there was the analogy of elderly persons displaying that frustration in relation to their experience at Centrelink. Of course, that this can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. I'm looking at this through the lens of technology, which is progressing incredibly fast, with people who are not able to keep up with the technology for a variety of reasons. Some might not have the, you know, the skill set. Perhaps the technology is not available, therefore inaccessible, incredibly expensive, therefore privilege. But for instance, in the context of not being able to learn or acquire the skill set, or not having the capacity to understand how to use these technologies. So for instance, someone that experiences cognitive or intellectual disabilities, should we be concerned about technologies deepening divisions? Again, thinking about people with an intellectual disability. Of course, you know, it comes with a disclaimer that I'm not one of the people that is afraid of technologies, but I'm thinking about, should we be concerned about creating a class of people that are rendered irrelevant, basically, because they don't know how to use that technology?
Hey, Maria, we had a little bit of trouble hearing you in the room, so I'm just going to recap what I think your question was, and maybe shout out if this is not right. So Maria does work, she's doing a PhD, looking at people with intellectual cognitive disabilities, and she's wondering if we should be concerned about the divide deepening for this particular group when we talk about digital technologies. And we've already spoken a lot in the room about people not having the literacy or not being able to access or not having that privilege to use technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I mean, Maria, did you want to just add something to that, or did Katie capture?
I was just about to say that was spot on, Katie.
That's great. I mean, I think, yeah, Maria, absolutely so. I mean, I think that's what, in that piece of research I maybe mentioned at the beginning, it seemed to me that was one of the insights there to say, and I think you're sort of adding to that a bit, to say, in the sense of the kind of gap around capacities of privilege deepening and widening. I think that is a real issue, just because of maybe the nature, the investment that's going into some of this, right, to bring these technologies to fruition, to embed them in different parts of social life, but without the recognition of how the complexity of this plays out for different groups of people, right, and different individuals as well, and people in different locations. And if there's not the countervailing work to go in to think about how to ensure that people are equipped to be able to, use the technologies or shape the technologies. I mean, if that's an issue. I mean, maybe that's part of it as well, is going back, the extent to which we get to go back one step and to say, with a bit about refusal, right, to say, can we go back and say, what's the terms upon which the technologies might be implemented into one's life? And there's people who work on, I'm thinking here of work of people doing emerging technologies, so the use of technologies around homes to regulate, say climate change or energy use and so on. And what people want from those technologies, right, that there's a sense in which some of the research emerging seems to suggest that, maybe by and large people don't want a fully automated home, but they might like some aspects of automation with information about the automation that they can make decisions about, right? So you can understand, what the energy use of particular technologies was at certain times, and then be able to actually kind of modify that. And maybe that's part of thinking about your question, Maria, to think about if you could start at that stage so that people actually, as well as, having more support, resources and so on to play with, to learn about technologies, it's also about to have some capacity, we have some capacity to shape the ways that technologies end up in our lives. Because some of what is imagined by some of the interests and actors shaping technology doesn't match up with what people might, want to actually do in their lives and want technology to do in their life. And that seems a long-standing gap. And maybe if we could start with that scenario, and then if people with cognitive disabilities were factored into that much more, making decisions, leading those scenarios, involved in the governance around it, that might help shift that logic as well. And then you can position, I think, the questions about capacity and capacity building and so on within that.
I agree. I think that's a really important point. And this reminds me of an issue around fear that has come up in a few projects that I've worked on. Firstly, the smartphone project that the AIC Discovery Mike and I did, where we discovered that supporters and carers of people with disabilities were really quite afraid of assistive features within smartphones. And they felt very unprepared to teach people with disabilities about how to use these features because they weren't using them in their everyday lives. So again, it's the people with disabilities who are the experts in this situation. And it's coming up again now, actually, in a project I'm doing on housing. And we've got a smart home aspect to this, which is largely a policy piece around how the NDIS and so it's social specialist disability accommodations speak to each other in a policy sense or don't actually speak to each other. And we're really interested in, that smart home aspect to it, how to integrate smart technology. So far we've spoken to, the housing experts and people working in community to facilitate the creation of these spaces. And they're just like, we don't know about technology. There's that real fear piece around technology and people feeling like they're not the experts. So, and that people with disabilities need to hear from them rather than other people with disabilities, which is really interesting and strange all at the same time. So I think, bringing in people with disabilities in that design phase again is a really important issue.
Because that's about the distribution of expertise, isn't it?
Yeah.
As well, just understanding that expertise is distributed, right? Rather than hearing.
And I think it's also about the uneven deployment of technology.
Right.
So, if you ask a Google speaker, you say, well, I need an ambulance and you're in Perth, and it's not sent to your phone. It starts doing it in alphabetical order. And the first one is an ambulance, is a museum for emergency services, and the second one is a training facility. So even the information you're getting from Google is not useful. Whereas, the new Apple phones, you'll call an ambulance if you've been in a car crash, and they haven't told them, it just pays attention to see if you've been in a crash. So you sort of, there's that real,
Right.
you can see how the fear gets there. You know, when I turn my Google enabled lights onto a different colour, it took me ages to work out how to make them normal again. Just had a green lounge for a week. It's certainly groovy.
So we only have a few more minutes left. Does anyone else have a question or comment for Gerard and Katie? No? All right, I'm going to ask a question about the NDIS. Seems like a nice place to finish, Gerard. So has Australia got the right policy setting and governance when it comes to digital technologies? For example, the NDIS reforms around including people with disabilities in the governance role.
Great question, Katie. I think I was going to ask you that question, but I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's part. I think. Well, I thought it was part of a broader piece at the moment. I was really interested to see the change in NDIS governance, right? The sense that at board level, that the minister, Bill Shorten, coming back in to say, to act on this sense that there's a major issue. And I just wondered about how that plays out and how it plays out around technology. I should just think that we probably need to do more work in this area to understand how's that work. And then how does the governance work around that? And then around technology more broadly, because it seems to me that's the problem, right? That the NDIS has this complexity to it that was built in from the start. I think someone was sort of remarking about this, about the paradox of user control, but in a neoliberal context, right? It's this kind of strange amalgam that's been hard to deal with and something that's been proved difficult to work through. But the governance seems to be a huge problem, right? I think now with the changes in governance having, you know, disability leaders visibly around the NDIS, there's hope, right? And talk about that. And I'm wondering what will happen around the technology aspects of this, because there was an earlier stage of the NDIS as well, where the NDIS was styling itself as an organisation that's going to use technology for better service, right? There were earlier iterations where it was saying, oh, we're going to improve our service. Were they involved in the famous, was it the Avatar that Kate Blanchett was involved in? Do you remember that NDIS?
Kelly,
Kind
do
of
you
characters.
Kelly, do you
No,
know
I
about it?
vaguely remember something about
Yeah.
it. I mean, they were very early days discussions, not talking to advertised.
Yeah. Well, I think they were trying to riff off some of that sort of digital transformations in government. What do you think?
Well, I think, as I've been saying, I think it's essential that people with disabilities are leading these kinds of discussions. And, when Kurt Fearnley became the NDIA board chair, there was big celebration amongst the disability community about that. And so last weekend, actually, it was International Day of People with Disabilities, and different people, commemorated the day in different ways. The Australian government had a ridiculous slogan, which was see past, see beyond the disability. And Jordan Steele-John came out and said, would you say to women, see beyond being a woman on International Women's Day? Or would you say that? So I noticed, though, that Kurt Fearnley was talking about what people with disabilities say to him. He has a podcast, and so he did kind of a wrap up of the different issues people have spoken to him about. And he spoke about Katia, who's one of our PhD students here, and how she's spoken a lot about segregated education. So, he had a number of different points, but one of the things that, really I felt was very powerful was that he critiqued law and policy. And he said, I'm not an expert on any of these things, I'm not a lawyer, but he noticed that they use a lot of terms like as far as possible or as much as possible. And, he was saying, why are we using these kind of qualifiers when we're talking about inclusion of people with disabilities? Why is it just as much as we can? you know, I'm sure that there was good intentions with this phrasing, but the phrasing now is a problem and we need to address that kind of phrasing. And I think they're the kind of issues that people with disabilities bring up in these kind of high profile governance roles that we might not get otherwise. So, but on digitisation, Mike and I attended, Mike spoke. We went to an NDIA roundtable last week, and I think they have a lot of work to do on digitisation and recognising that a lot of the issues that were spoken about in that day, you know, housing is one we've mentioned today too. There are digital aspects to that. There are digital aspects to work, education, and we have a digital shadow over all of our lives now. And the NDIS needs to start addressing that too. Yeah, and perhaps we could come up with some better communication. I haven't looked into that myself. Mike, did you want to add anything from NDIS?
Won't like it.
I won't like it.
So there's an argument that the NDIS is just an abdication of government responsibility to make everyone an equal member of society. So you can just throw money at a problem under the illusion of choice. And those words, when you say as much as possible and stuff like that, it's a system with the potential to go, yeah, we just put a freeze on the NDIS cap in, 2022 and now it's 2050. But people still have choice over the poultry services that they have left to choose from. And there's no sense that the government has a role to provide those services, to have that sort of equity. And I think that you can see the symptoms of that in the level of literacy that you need to do it. It's no one's job. I mean, Bill's obviously said it is someone's job to help, but there is that element that if you can negotiate if you have the wherewithal to negotiate a better NDIS setup, then you can get it. If you can find a better carer or a cheaper transport service or something, then you're doing better, as opposed to we will guarantee this level of service to all Australians. And I think that is something under the celebration of the NDIS. There's that neoliberal foundation to it, which there are all these philosophical questions which we then don't really engage with. And I think that is,
Always about getting to the point where you don't need any money anymore. Always was about.
Yeah.
That's what people forget. Never about here's a whole lot of money for the rest of your life. Always about here's a whole lot of money now, and the bucket will get smaller and smaller because it's an insurance scheme.
It's a contradiction, and it seems to see Mr. Short deal with those two poles like a government. Speak on the radio, saying, well, people have the right to swing critique. Does the sort of things you describe. I mean, when it comes, I suppose, from a communications rights perspective, it seems to me that in the convention, the provision on communications rights is on an equal basis, right? The people with disabilities have the right to communicate, express, and so on an equal basis to everyone else. So it's interesting to see me about NDI, how does communication rights work in that sense? And it is a version of the social good. As a society, if one has the right to this support indigenous needs in society, how's it delivered? Mechanism is an experiment like NDIS. It's complex, right?
It is.
And it's got all sorts of hedging around it.
Could be worse. It is all very complex, and we are out of time. So let's thank Professor Gerard Goggin for the Q&A / presentation for our very last ACAT of the year.